On this cold New Year's night, as the entire city was celebrating, my business partner leaned in and whispered in my ear, "The police are waiting outside, Edward. Either sign this confession admitting you embezzled millions from the company, or I'll play those videos of your daughter right here at the party, and it'll destroy her life." In that moment, I knew this New Year's was going to be the last year of freedom I'd ever have. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. The room smelled like champagne and expensive perfume. Laughter bounced off the walls like someone trying to prove they were happy. I should have been part of it, smiling, shaking hands, trading the small lies men trade at events like that. Instead, everything narrowed to the thin paper in his hand and the pen he slid toward me, as if he were offering a harmless signature, not a sentence. The music swelled toward midnight, and I found I could not hear it. The words he said landed somewhere behind my ribs, and set a clock ticking that had nothing to do with the ball dropping. For half a breath, I tried to treat it like a puzzle. Did he actually have the videos? Would he dare? The doubt could have been my saving grace, if it lasted, if I could find the proof that what he threatened was bluff. But he didn't need to show me the files to make the threat lethal. The idea of private things scraped into the open, edited and looped, can do damage with or without explicit content. People only need the impression, the suggestion, the timing. That realization hit harder than the pen in my hand. I thought back, the way men do, searching for where things had shifted. There had been small changes the last year, calls that weren't returned, transactions explained with a laugh, a generosity that felt like leverage in the same breath. You forgive those things when you're tired, because trust lubricates business. But trust is also the thing someone breaks when they're planning to take everything. For him, it seemed easier to wreck a life in public than to bury crooked books. Public ruin doesn't require accountants. It requires spectacle. My daughter's face filled my head the way a photo fills a frame. 22, loudly human, the sort of girl who left her records on the floor and used the counter as a stack of her life. She had a laugh that made the kitchen warm. All of that could be reduced to a clip on someone's feed, and 1,000 people who owed nothing to her would become instant judges. The thought of that, her life rearranged by strangers, made something animal in me rise. Protect, shield, pay the price. He offered guarantees like a man selling insurance. Signed, notarized. That sort of language meant to anesthetize the conscience. He spoke of destroying the files once I signed. He promised me an outcome that read tidy on paper. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I had been naive enough to think a signed paper could chain a man prone to making contingency plans. Men like him keep backups the way other men keep receipts. A signature might buy a night's quiet, but not loyalty. Outside, fireworks stitched the sky with light that felt obscene. People kissed and counted down to a moment I had just traded away. The calculus was hideous and immediate. Years of my freedom for a daughter's intact reputation. The law would come for me if I signed. Social media and rumor would come for her if I refused. Which harm do you choose for someone you love? It's not an academic question. It's the kind that lives in your body, while people who don't know you toast to the future. I let the pen hover because it was the only thing I could do that felt like control. For a minute, every principle I had ever treasured argued with the same force as the instinct to protect. Would a courtroom scar my family in a way that social ruin wouldn't? Or would my absence, me behind bars, be worse for them than a name dragged through headlines? I thought of my father, the way he squared his shoulders when neighbors whispered. He had taught me to bear shame, to hold a steady face. But fatherhood changes the ledger. You don't calculate pride the same way when a child's life is on the line. I signed. The ink was louder than the music. He folded the paper, slid it into his pocket, and pressed a thumb to my shoulder with the casual intimacy of a man who had purchased obedience. We left the ballroom together, under confetti, That felt like snow on a grave. My phone lit with ordinary messages, "Happy New Year," and smiling faces, each one a small, obscene reminder that the world went on around my decision. I didn't call my daughter then because whatever I said would sound like an excuse or a lie. I wanted to tell her the truth, and also to protect her from a truth that might make her life worse. Morning came with the small cruelty of light that reveals. There were no videos on feeds, no squad cars outside my building. For a while, the signature felt like success. Nothing had happened. But the quiet after a storm is often the worst part. Time is not an ally when someone has leverage. I started making small inquiries, checks on accounts, quiet calls to people I trusted, the kind of defensive moves that don't set off alarms but preserve evidence. The lawyer I called moved like she had done this before. The forensic accountant I hired had a way of looking at numbers that read like testimony. Every quiet step we took revealed a little more of the pattern he'd tried to hide. And then, in the dark between sleep and the possibility of waking, my daughter's name flashed across my phone. "Dad, are you okay? I heard something." Her text was a small animal of panic. I could taste the floor. The move I'd made at midnight had not put a lid on anything. It had only rearranged the next play. The partner had not been satisfied with an exchange. Men like him view bargains as the beginning of a relationship, where the stronger keeps making demands. I should have been calmer. I should have moved like a man with contingency plans. Instead, fear turned my ideas into clarity. If he was going to use public spectacle, I realized, I had to attack the one thing he couldn't fake: the record. Lies need cover. Fabrications leave fingerprints. A man who builds an extortion on a pile of confidence will often sprinkle breadcrumbs. Offshore accounts, dummy vendors, encrypted messages that reveal choices under pressure. That was the place to strike back. Method, not melodrama. The first day after the wedding, no, after the party, I watched people at work and wondered which of them would look away and which would keep the story alive for the thrill. Reputation travels on good intentions and lazy assumptions. If someone saw my name on a headline, I imagined them nodding with the same casual moralism they'd used all year. That image made my resolve colder. If he wanted spectacle, I would give him exposure. I would dismantle him in a way that left no room for a staged martyr. We began to gather logs, transaction histories, message threads. The forensic accountant found oddities, payments that looked innocuous until you traced the chain, shell companies that existed to reroute funds in delays too precise for coincidence. The lawyer filed protective orders and deadlines that stopped the files from being handed around legally. Each move felt like assembling a small army of facts. He had thought his bluff would hold, because most men are cowed by fear, not prepared to fight back with slow patience. I learned that desperation can be a blunt instrument. The nights were long and thin. I slept in short bursts, while my mind kept mapping the lines he could use to hurt us. Doubts crept in every hour. Had I missed other signs? Did my family know the pattern of my life enough to survive the fallout from either choice? Would people pity a father who signed, or resent one who tried to engineer his way out of public scrutiny? The moral texture of what I had done shifted in my head. Was my signature protection or cowardice? It didn't matter who judged me then. What mattered was where the fight would erupt and who would stand to lose everything. We set small traps, legal moves and public timing meant to defang the spectacle he craved. We reached out to people who would care about facts rather than hunger for drama. I called an old friend who ran a paper, a reporter who had a reputation for cutting through influence. We moved the pieces quietly, threading evidence into a narrative that could not be shouted down with a single video clip. If he tried to make her the story we would bring would be about the system he used to try to crush us. Still, every time a phone rang, I braced. Every notification had the potential to be a blade. The tension settled into the bones of our days. My daughter tried to be brave in ways she didn't need to be. She made jokes that were too bright and too fast. I watched her and felt an ache that had nothing to do with headlines. I thought about the ledger of our lives. What is currency and what is cost? And how sometimes you spend a piece of yourself to save someone else. It felt like bankruptcy and salvation at the same time. There were small victories, accounts frozen, emails preserved, but the real contest was psychological. He had wanted to show us naked and vulnerable. Instead, we chose to show how he had been methodically hungry. Each fact we pulled was a light turned on in a room he thought he owned. The more we illuminated, the more he crouched in the dark, looking for a corner to hide in. And yet the night when everything shifted was not the one we expected. It was not a courtroom or a viral feed that finally forced his hand. It was the way a single call, a single message, and the timing of an ordinary morning exposed the truth in a way that public spectacle could not conceal. I stood at the kitchen table, the same table where homework had been spread and peanut butter sandwiches eaten, and felt the world I had built tilt. The move I'd made at midnight had not ended the problem. It had set the sequence. The next second is where the rest of this unravels. The next second arrived like a fault opening under my feet. My thumb hovered, then dropped, and her message glowed back at me. "Dad, are you okay? I heard something." I grabbed my keys and drove with a speed that felt like panic dressed up as purpose. When I walked in, the TV in the den played a muted clip on loop, a cropped frame, a laugh, a shadow of movement, enough to choke a person if the room had been full of strangers. She sat folded in on herself, eyes wide the way a small animal looks when it has nowhere to run. The thing I had tried to buy for her safety had become a living question in her hands. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I made plans. I called the lawyer whose cards lived in my drawer for reasons that suddenly mattered. Within an hour, she had me doing things that felt like housekeeping, but were actually war preparation. Preserve every device, create forensic snapshots, contact our IT people, and ask for logs without alarm. We were quiet soldiers assembling armor. I watched my daughter breathe and send her a single line, "I'm here." It was all either of us needed to hear, and all either of us could bear at that moment. The forensic accountant found patterns like a hunter finds prints in the snow, tiny transfers that connected to shells, invoices that repeated numbers as if someone was using a code to hide an appetite. Where my partner had thought he was clever, he had been procedural. Men who build altars to their own safety often assume nobody will look at the foundation. We looked. We traced wires and emails. We found a handful of messages where he discussed cleaning up and making a problem disappear, with a bluntness that felt obscene in the light. We did not run to social media with accusation or grief. We built a different kind of presence. Facts, chain of custody, documented timelines. I reached out to a reporter who had never been starstruck by power, someone who prized accuracy and hated theatrics. She read the files and asked the question that narrowed everything. Do you want him taken down for the theft, or for the method he used to threaten your family? The answer was both. He had telescoped two crimes into one instant, financial malfeasance and the weaponization of private life. We staged a meeting that looked ordinary on paper, a board gathering with a presentation, partners in the room, a public registrar on standby. It was a place he would expect to command. It was also a place where presence mattered. Witnesses, minutes, a room that could not be spun into rumor without consequence. I baited him with a rumor we fed precisely, that someone had new material to show. Arrogance is predictable. He would move to seize the stage. He would try to use the very tactic he'd used on me to control a narrative. He did what we hoped he would do. When he opened his laptop that night, the room leaned toward him the way a crowd leans toward a carnival act. He brought up the folder and flicked through a few thumbnails like a man setting out trophies. At that moment, our lawyer stood and asked, politely, to see the originals for verification. He hesitated, The journalist I had tipped into the room flashed a small smile and recorded on a pocket device. The legal team produced documents that froze anything he might try to push into the public: protective orders, a chain of custody for the supposed clips, and then calmly the accounting chain that traced a money flow only an insider could have orchestrated. He tried to pivot. There is always a moment when a man who believes in performance will attempt to reclaim it with a story of noble intent. His words that night were the words of a man whose script had been ripped from his hands. We walked through ledger entries, timestamps, emails. We showed boxes of payments routed through companies that existed only to receive and relay funds. The room shifted. People who had sat comfortably in his aura now watched the mechanics of the thing he had built, and mechanics are harder to worship than charisma. When the board moved to suspend him pending an independent review, it was not the final hammer, but it was public and it was precise. Suspension is a formal, cold thing, an administrative amputation. The press, which feeds off spectacle, found in this a better story than the scandal he had prepared: a man who had tried to publicly humiliate the child of a partner to hide the books. The narrative buckled under the weight of documents. Allies called with thin voices. The calls were measured for distance. His colleagues issued statements that were practical and clinical, the kind that quietly erodes support. He tried to say he had been coerced, that he had acted to protect the company from impropriety. The audio and message trail we had collected made that lie awkward. He had written plainly about cleaning up and removing obstacles. The prosecutor, who eventually took interest, moved with the file in hand. I learned then how effective bureaucracy can be when you give it solid paper. It moves slow, yes, but it moves with a kind of moral gravity that spectacle cannot outrun. I did not rejoice at his unraveling. There is no joy in watching a person you once trusted collapse. The satisfaction was colder and clearer. It was the settling of accounts in a ledger that, for once, balanced toward truth. He lost authority, then clients, then the casual respect that had allowed him to walk into rooms and matter. Reputation is an accrual. Once the deposits stop, the withdrawals are visible and quick. My daughter came through the other side with a kind of exhausted dignity. She did not want the attention, but she handled it with a steadiness that surprised me. We shielded her as best we could, offered measured statements, refused the greedy interviews. The thing that could have defined her became, instead, one of many facts in a larger story about a man who used other people's privacy like currency. That change mattered. It did not make the nights easier. It made the nights honest. There was legal work that followed: reviews, audits, investigations. We paid attorneys and found ourselves in meetings with men in suits who did not know how to feel about private pain. They treated it as a problem to be solved. The cost was real. Money poured into defense and into the processes of exposure. Friends asked awkward questions. Family members who had once assumed control were now forced to act. These are the quiet taxes revenge exacts, iron rules that few people count before they decide to fight. But there is an intelligence to this kind of justice. It is not about breaking a man physically. It is about removing the tools he used, the access, the platform, the network of small lies. We closed the channels he relied on. We made the kind of exposure that prosecutors respect and the press can't reduce to a single clip. We let the system, slow and imperfect, do the work that anger alone cannot complete. Weeks later, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of articles about the investigation and the board statement. I thought about the signature I had given, the theft of a piece of myself in exchange for my daughter's immediate safety. I thought about whether that signature had been cowardice or calculation. Time had complicated the moral calculus. The signature had bought something, a night where she didn't have to face a roomful of judgment. It also started a chain reaction that, with careful tending, ended the man who thought he could buy lives for leverage. In the end, his fall was public and clean. He was stripped of his title. The company separated him. Clients withdrew, and his name became a cautionary paragraph rather than the headline he once enjoyed. There was no cinematic violence, no car chase, no final blow. The revenge we engineered was surgical, truth amplified and patience weaponized. He lost access, authority, credibility. The worst thing for a man of his type was lighter than I expected. The way people no longer trusted him, the quiet of empty invitations, the small refrains of polite avoidance. I do not tell this to boast. I tell it because I promised myself, in that midnight panic, that my daughter's life would not be the price of a man's hunger. The ledger of lives is complicated. I had to spend a piece of myself to save another. I learned that protection can mean compromise, and compromise sometimes becomes the only honest fight you have. There is a bitter comfort in watching a man who tried to weaponize shame lose the platform to project it. It is not pleasure, it is a settling, an accounting. You measure it not by vengeance, but by the removal of harm he could do. The quiet that followed was not peace so much as a new kind of watchfulness, an understanding that safety is fragile and has to be maintained by work, by documentation, by refusing to be bullied into private silences. If this story meant something to you, like the video, subscribe and let me know your thoughts below. Thanks for listening.